It's lovely to have you here, Andreas, and I promised Richard and Mark that I would try and make this much more of a business discussion rather than a techie discussion. So those of you geeks who are in the room, you're going to be disappointed because we're not going to be talking about pipes and stuff like that. We're going to be talking about the commercial aspects. And the subject of programmatic is, it takes up so much discussion, and it takes up a disproportionate amount of discussion. And yet, as we discussed, as an industry, to put it into perspective, in terms of what you call pure programmatic, the industry only turns over globally, that channel, 500 million, and that's in a $500 million, that's in a market, a $40 billion market, and yet, it's on everybody's lips. And I guess the reason for that is because it has so much potential. But then I'm reminded of something that Warren Buffett said about 30 years ago when he was asked about investing in China. And he said, well, China is a land of great opportunity and shall remain so. So my first question to you is, when are we going to see programmatic becoming a serious channel in terms of incremental revenues and growing the pie, which is so important for us to bust that 5% syndrome?
Great question. So I tend to look at the world as in three buckets. Each country can be categorized either as a starting market in programmatic, a scaling market into programmatic out of home, or a settled market into programmatic out of home. I actually feel that in the settled markets, programmatic is a significant part of their sales strategies. And in some markets, such as Canada, for example, it represents already 30% of their digital out-of-home spend. On the starting markets, it's brand new. It's just getting started. And that's where you're starting off at can you, in your first year launching into the market, help media owners drive 5% to 10% of new revenue towards them? So
that's a great segue into APAC. How would you describe APAC? I know that it's different in each market, but generally, we talked yesterday about, for example, the lack of widespread audience measurement. So access to data is an important part of your product. How would you describe in those three categories APAC?
So if you look at what happened in Australia, what Charles did and what Charmaine did with Move, that really contributed to having a unified measurement system that really helped the Australian industry become almost 70% digital. And you have to first, as a prerequisite, be a digital out-of-home first company in order to receive programmatic revenue, which is a subset of that. So in countries like Japan, we've seen Liveboard lobby behind having a unified measurement system, and now we're seeing Liveboard having awesome growth in Japan. So every market where there is a concentrated effort to have an industry association, it's much easier to launch programmatic out-of-home and garner incremental revenue.
And what about data? Obviously, you need to have digital inventory, but in terms of audience measurement, CPMs, how do you cope in the emerging markets in those areas?
So it's changed a lot. In my business, we always have to pivot almost every year to adapt with the times. When Apple launched iOS 14, it got really hard to access IDFAs, and Google Sandbox is deprecating Google Android IDs. And we use location data historically to make sense of movement patterns of consumers outside of the home, which guides DSPs on how to value inventory, whether they should bid higher or lower. Now, with the deprecation of those IDs, how do we essentially help buyers and marketers reach audiences that matter to them? Well, the trend we're seeing is the retailers have the awesome first-party data on their own customers, and they're actually exposing that for other ad tech channels. Like in the US, Walmart Connects launched their own business as a data business. And so I think that's going to continue to happen. We see a lot of retailers getting into the data business, and they have awesome first-party data on their customers. And that will, in my opinion, drive activation of digital programmatic out-of-home.
So two very commercial questions that media owners constantly ask me, and that is how do you assess the incremental element of the revenues that come through the programmatic channel first, and secondly, the question I get asked from some brands is, where's the transparency in the process? If I spend $100, how much of that gets to the publisher?
So on the first question, how do we assess incrementality? Because media owners are connecting into supply-side platforms to monetize inventory, and they have their sales forces already. So it's a lot less interesting to them if you're an ad tech company that just inserts itself in the money flow of revenue they're already getting. So that's not celebratory for us. The way we look at it is there's different sort of layers of incrementality. So when we enter into a brand new market like Indonesia and we build relationships with media owners, we focus on bringing money from outside of Indonesia into Indonesia. So we look at either buyers in other markets, like in Singapore, for example, brands that want to activate. Now, when we do that, it's clearly incremental because it's coming from a country outside of a country where they have a sales force. So that's a big score and a home run for us because media owners say that is 100% incremental. And that's how we go into starting markets. Now, next level down, in terms of celebration in the spectrum of is it truly incremental, is if the buyer is buying through an omni-channel demand-side platform. So we have awesome partners like the Trade Desk, with awesome partners like Google DV360. And the profile of people that buy through those omni-channel DSPs are agencies that always buy multiple channels. And usually that's a very different group of people than the people that the media owner's own sales force are speaking to. So in that regard, we feel that is incremental. If it's going through an omni-channel DSP, that too we deem to be incremental. The part where things can get cannibalized a little bit, and that's not something that we necessarily celebrate, and it doesn't really happen in APAC too much. It's more in the UK and the US, is when out-of-home agencies that focus just on the out-of-home channel buy through a DSP. That's where media owners naturally say, well, we're getting that revenue already. So that's where it's up to the ad tech platforms to really come up with a fee structure that makes sense and scales. I think an ad tech platform has a right to make a fee if it's proving that the revenue came in incrementally, and it should make a much smaller fee if actually it's just automating revenue that the media owner would have already gotten. On the second question, the sort of breakdown of the commercials of the anatomy of a buy is, an agency programmatically will want to log in hands-on into a demand-side platform where they can see the locations of screen. Maybe they want to import their own audiences that they have and use that to guide a DSP like a Trade Desk or a DV360 on what screens to light up where and when. So if there's $1 million, forgive me, I'm not using Indonesian rupiahs, but $1 million US campaign going into a DSP, the anatomy is as follows. The agency has $1 million campaign, they place $1 million into a DSP. The DSP, let's use round numbers just so we can actually talk this through, might charge a 10% DSP fee if it's an omni-channel DSP. So of the $1 million, the DSP will invoice the agency $1 million. The $1 million is then 10% is kept. That's $900,000 is left over. The DSP pays the SSP the $900,000. The SSP now represents the interest of the sell side, tries to get the highest CPM. They may keep 10%, and what's left is basically $810,000 that goes to the publisher.
Yes, but that isn't clear, is it? That's a hypothetical situation, which sounds very reasonable. But how do we get to a situation where the brands don't have to ask that it's a transparent transaction? So
what's great about what has happened in our industry, programmatic out-of-home in its infancy in other markets 5 years ago, started off mostly as an open exchange buy. It started off where there was very little transparency. It was not clear what are the fees in the middle and so forth. What's happening now, the dynamic I see is media owners have really smart sales forces that are able to speak the language of programmatic to the buy side. And what happens is what are normally transacted as a direct buy are now as a private marketplace setup. So they negotiate with each other, and then they agree on pricing and markets and audience targeting. And then the media owner logs into a supply-side platform and surfaces a deal ID. Now the fees for the SSP side is charged to the media owner. The media owner knows it's a withholding fee. So if they get $900,000, they know that $90,000 is going to the SSP. It's not marked up along the chain. And similarly, the agency knows what DSP fee they are paying as well. So because we've moved to PMPs, transparency, I feel, has been solved with that.
So that touches on the gamekeeper and poacher question, because you have some pure SSPs, have some pure DSPs and omnis. Then you have people who are both. And I know when you kicked off, you were dancing on both sides. What's your view on that at this stage in the market?
So it really varies country per country. And you know, we celebrate our role. What we see ourselves is we have our mission statement is to bring and generate new revenue for media owners. And so if you read behind the lines there, that's SSP language. And that's really where I see our North Star as a company. But what had to happen when I founded Hivestack in 2017, our awesome partners that we have today, like the Googles and the Trade Desk, were not yet active in programmatic digital out of home. And so we had two choices. We could either sit and wait as a pure play SSP and have very little money going into the media owners and talk about theoretically what happened one day, or we can get in the field and temporarily get into the DSP business to help facilitate the money to flow, knowing full well that the end game, you know, DV360 and Trade Desk and the omni-channel DSPs will represent in 3 to 5 years the bulk of the programmatic revenue coming into media owners.
So you're gravitating towards a pure SSP business?
Yeah, we see it as a multi-pivot journey, and but our North Star is bringing incremental revenue to media owners via our supply side.
Sure. I'm going to be throwing this open to questions from the floor, so if any of you have any questions that I haven't asked, Gianji and his team have got a roving mic going around there, so please do come forward. Yeah, we got one straight away. That was quick.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes. Good morning, Andreas and Tom. So yesterday, Melanie mentioned that it is very important for media owners to fulfill the brief of the agency and providing as much information as possible about how the proposal that they put forward matches the brief, and the way that she took the example of Who Media, for instance, with the sales team spending a lot of time preparing an answer to the brief. So how this qualitative response to agencies would work with programmatic, because programmatic is all online, so there is no like direct sales in a certain way. So how do you put forward your best foot forward as a media owner when you are going to basically transact programmatically?
Is that to me or to Andrea?
That's for Andreas.
Thank
Sorry.
you. Thank you. So in terms of when the brief comes in, there are fundamental goals that need to be reached. What are the main KPIs? Is this an awareness campaign? Is this a campaign to drive some kind of consideration or intent, or is it to drive footfall visitation? That is usually the most important part to identify in the brief. How do you measure success? What's the yardstick for success? And in platforms, company platforms like yours and Broadsign, I know that that's a first-class citizen in being able to make sure that there are reporting tools that tie into device graphs, that tie into perhaps clean rooms to identify, for example, and transparently, are you driving footfall? Are you driving awareness? Are you raising consideration? So I feel that the supply-side platforms in our space are doing a really good job of prioritizing KPIs as a first-class citizen, and that's what leads the way in making sure that the campaign delivery matches the actual brief.
Does that answer the question? Good. So if anybody else has any questions, yeah, we got another one here.
Hi, Andreas. Can a publisher have tie-ups with multiple SSPs at the same time? can a publisher have multiple tie-ups with different SSPs at the same time?
Absolutely, and they should. So, if I was a publisher and I operated a few hundred amazing digital billboards, if it was me, I would have a contract with every SSP that could bring revenue to me incrementally. And so they absolutely, and Indonesia is already, what's interesting about here is the feedback out there in the coffee breaks is when I speak to the media owners, they're already eyeing about 3 or 4 SSPs right from the beginning. And that's what should happen. But it does introduce a new layer of complexity though, because usually the way this all works, there's like a content management system, and usually inventory on the digital side is structured as a loop. So there may be 8 spots in a loop, and spot number 8 might be an HTML wrapper associated with one SSP. Spot number 7 might go to SSP number 2, spot number 3. And you get into a situation where some of these inventories are now going to programmatic, and the direct sales force complains, hey, we're sold out, but we're not really sold out. So it's introducing a new category of complexity, which is a yield management problem. And that's where I feel strongly that one area of future development is for the whole industry is programmatic mediation across all SSPs. So having a type of a header bidder that can be used by media owners, well, they can make one ad request to a header bidder, and that header bidder propagates the ad request with a unified auction to all SSPs and picks the highest CPM. And we're making sure that even Hivestack, our own SSP, competes fairly in that unified auction. And the way that we prove the transparency that it's a true fair auction is we open source the actual code behind the unified auction so people can inspect and see Hivestack's SSP is not being preferred more than others when Hivestack's header bidding is used. So yes, uses all the SSPs, but you're going to probably have to solve the integration problem. And what media owners do is they usually use a waterfall. They first check SSP1. Oh, it's empty. Try SSP2. But what you want to do is simultaneously ask all SSPs, what's your highest CPM, and pick the highest one. So yes, and I also think that mediation and header bidding will play an important role solving that.
And the second question is, do the ad tech platforms compete for the same business? So if there's a brief by a client, do the platforms compete for the same business?
Yes, that's normal, and Unilever has relationships with Trade Desk. Procter & Gamble has relationships with DV360. This happens, of course, in display and mobile and video on the DSP side. And then on the SSP side, what we're seeing now is when companies like Nexus, which is the new addressable unit of Group M, logs into an omni-channel DSP, they have a choice what PMP they want to buy. And that's good. They can choose SSP1, SSP2, and it's the same inventory. So how do they sort of pick which PMP? And so there is competition there. How do SSPs in the out-of-home space differentiate against each other to win those budgets for the publishers? So it is very competitive at all levels across ad tech.
How many publishers do you actually transact with?
400 as of today in 33 countries. And these are publishers that are making, it's not like a database. They're making always-on ad requests to Hivestack programmatically. Hey, Hivestack, do you have a buyer? We process almost 30 billion bid requests daily through the platform globally. We're just propagating on the megaphone. Is there a buyer for this? Is there a buyer for this?
And is most of your energy taken up actually transacting with those publishers? How much of your effort do you put into actually accessing the brand money?
So we put a lot of effort into accessing the brand money because one of the learnings I've had, and I've been in out-of-home for a long time, is if you win budgets that are incremental from the buy side, de facto, you will get the supply side relationships. And so we focus really on the buy side, and we get the supply side inherently by doing so.
So basically you're saying we're all tarts in the media owner side. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm obsessed with multipliers. Can you talk about talk more about it, because I think that in terms of multipliers, because I believe as we transition from the more traditional to the digital programmatic, that will be the next thing, in my opinion. But anyway, I'd love to hear more about that. Thank you.
For sure. So I'll elaborate on the question a little bit. So I feel like what you're asking here is there's impression multipliers hourly for every single screen in programmatic, where there's a media owner makes an ad request from a screen at a specific time. What are the number of impressions that could be won if that transaction happens on that screen? Now that's where I feel strongly that if there is a unified measurement body in that country, that's where companies like ours get the data from directly. We don't want to be in that business. We don't think we should be marking our own homework, and we think that should be coming from an industry organization. Now, we have expanded so much. We're in a lot of emerging markets. Sometimes we have to get on the ice. That's a Canadian expression, excuse me, for hockey. We have to get on the field to assist media owners to create some impression multipliers, but we are all about taking the impression multipliers in Canada as Comb, Australia Move, USA Geopath, what Liveboard is doing in Japan. That's where impression multipliers should come from.
Any other questions? Charles, you must have one. Where's Charles? Any questions?
More comment around the multipliers on growth. I think it's very interesting.
Is the mic coming, Charles?
I was more a comment about the impression multiplier, Andreas, because you make a very important point, particularly in a region where there is a distinct lack of audience measurement. And one of the conversations we're often having is that a barrier for the publishers to get involved in programmatic? Because yes, in Australia we have an industry-wide impressions multiplier, but what if I am a publisher in the room today, I don't have audience measurement? Does that mean I can or cannot participate with Hivestack?
It's a great question. So in some of the emerging markets and that we operate in, for example in Taiwan, and this was I think some of your questions, what we saw is we basically, some media owners who are not party to an MRC accredited organization like a Move, what happens is they create their own multipliers, or we help them say, okay, here's the mobility data, this is what movement data looks like, what's your 4-week circulation number? We help them with some plausible basic arithmetic on how to back that into an hourly count. But what we've seen in some cases, omni-channel demand-side platforms like Google and Trade Desk, they care a lot about the quality of the inventory that their buyers can access. And so we saw some situations where some media owners were not allowed to be listed for purchase in DV360, which was a good thing because Google deemed that it was not from, the impression multipliers were not coming from an MRC accredited source. And so that's where in some emerging markets, until there is an industry organization or an industry body like in Taiwan, for example, we go to a Nielsen and we say, hey, can you guys get on the ice here and do a study for this media owner and give a stamp of approval of their media owner, of their impression multipliers, or say something's wrong here. And once Nielsen gives us that, then we go to Google and say, here, this media owner now has an MRC accredited approved impression multiplier. Will you now onboard them? And that's how we get them in. But that shouldn't happen that way. It should really be through the industry organizations. That's a temporary stepping stone.
So I think...
Thank you.
I think the important point is you've removed that barrier. The publishers.
Yeah, we've removed that barrier. That's what I mean by why do we have a DSP and S? Because we wanted to eliminate those friction points to help the money flow. And we're all about removing those friction points, knowing full well that our North Star is not to be a measurement company, is not to be in that business. So it's eliminating those friction points to let the money flow.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
I'm just going to allow 1 or 2 more questions. I've got one more. We saw yesterday the Lumascape chart, which shows the maze of proliferation that exists on the tech side between the brands and the publishers. Do you think we are near to a situation where there's going to be consolidation on the tech side and a reduction in this fragmented situation in the same ways we're getting now on the media owner side?
I think so. I think that, you know, there's a lot of innovation, and that creates a lot of boxes in those Lumascape and a lot of logos in the Lumascape. And even if you look at display and mobile, there's been immense consolidation there. There's really 3 or 4 DSPs that represent most of the money globally on display and mobile. There's 3 or 4 SSPs that represent the money for display and mobile and CTV. And I do think that's going to happen. I believe that 2024 is going to be a big M&A year for 2024, as early as next year for programmatic out-of-home. I think that, you know, it makes a lot of sense to sort of work together and come together. And, you know, our real competitor, all of us in this room, right, are the other channels. How do we, you know, you spoke yesterday about 6% being the average share that programmatic out-of-home has of the entire channel. How do we get that to 20%, right? And I think that becomes faster when we come together, and I think there's a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Anybody else? One last question? No? Good. Andreas, thank you so much for coming. Isn't he a really nice guy? Andreas was awarded a leadership merit at our Lisbon Congress, and you can see why. I mean, this guy spends most of his life on an airplane. He's a global business. You've built a very recognizable brand, and it's a lot of hard work. And you know, people think that ad tech is the yellow brick road, but you know, dealing with 400 publishers mustn't be easy. So a big round of applause for Andreas.